Welcome to CivilNet. We are in Tsaghkadzor, participating and covering an international symposium on Russia organized by the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at Monterey. And I'm here joined by Dominic Lieven, a distinguished British scholar and professor of Russian and international history, who is participating in the symposium. Professor, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for asking me.
So you authored a number of books, and the recent one, entitled In the Shadow of Gods, is about empires, how they evolve, how they're interacted. If we juxtapose, if we compare the empires that belong to the ancient history and the empire that evolved during the 18th, 19th century and transpired to the 20th century, how the very definition of an empire evolved.
I mean, the first thing I would say is that I wrote a book in 2001 about empires. This last book was actually about emperors. It was as much about leadership and about biography and about hereditary monarchy as a system of government as it was about empire. But nevertheless, I mean, in answer to your question, there are many similarities between empires since ancient times and the modern, particularly transoceanic empires, but there are significant differences as well. One obvious one is that the gap between the metropole and the periphery, the colonies, if you want to put it that way, is inevitably more blurred in a land empire. You know, populations are more blurred across a boundary. It's seldom so clear, for example, in a land empire that this is the rule of one people over others. Another obvious difference between the modern West European overseas empires and many land empires, particularly that large group of empires which were founded by steppe nomads or their descendants, is cultural. You know, the transoceanic European empires carried with them a tremendous cultural arrogance, a belief that they were in the forefront of progress, and that the cultural exchange between the rulers and, if you like, the colonized was one way. But if you look at the many of the great empires of Eurasia, the land empires, the Mughals, for instance, or the Qing in China, and many, many other examples, where you were dealing with conquerors who came either directly or in origin from the nomadic steppe world. On the contrary, even they themselves often recognized that the high cultures they conquered, whether Persian or Chinese, were superior to their own. And actually, far from the cultural influences being one way from the colonizer to the colonized, if anything, it went the other way round. So that, for instance, you know, the Qing, the Manchu, conquer China and then are conquered culturally in many ways and to a great extent disappear. And mutatis mutandis, you could find plenty other examples of that as well. So there are very fundamental differences as well as important similarities.
Even the Greeks were superior culturally when they were conquered by the Romans.
Yes, I mean, the Roman Empire is in that sense somewhere in the middle. On the one hand, it is an empire driven by a civilizing mission in the West, or at least it considers itself immeasurably superior to the tribal peoples of Western Europe that it conquered. In the East, it's a different matter. Many members of the Roman elite do indeed agree that Greek high culture is superior to their own, and are not merely full of respect for it, but even deference, in just the same way, well, not to quite the same extent, that Emperor Kangxi of the Qing, for instance, or Emperor Akbar of the Mughals, is deeply deferential, both to, you know, ancient Chinese in the first case, and ancient Persian and even Indian Sanskrit high culture.
So the empires used to provide certain sort of security and stability over their peripheries, and when their empires collapse, global calamities start. To what extent the current international order is stemming from that from that sort of balance, from that sort of interaction between the empires?
Well, I mean, it depends which parts of the world we're talking about, but obviously, that's true in the former Soviet Union. Look, if you go back to the 1890s, the chief legal advisor of the Russian, of course, imperial foreign ministry, a man called Theodor Martins, said that if the national principle, in other words, to every nation defined by ethnicity and language, to some extent history, there should be a state, which he acknowledged was becoming, the dominant ideology in much of the Anglophone world, etc. If that triumphed in the vast region of the world, which in his day was ruled over by the Romanovs, the Habsburgs, the Hohenzollerns, and the Ottomans, then there would be absolute chaos and mayhem. And it was right, of course. It's taken 2 world wars, genocide in the fullest meaning of the term, ethnic cleansing on a truly vast scale, for example, of the entire, or almost the entire German diaspora in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, to turn the map of Europe from a map of empire, map of East Central Europe, Eastern and Central, from the map of empire to the map of nation. Well, we're still dealing with the consequences of the collapse of the Ottoman Empire throughout much of the Middle East. We haven't actually created stable, let alone democratic nation states. And the Soviet Union was in one sense the last of the empires, and its collapse means that we are now facing the same kind of chaos that we faced after the collapse of the Romanovs, the Habsburgs, and the Hohenzollerns and the Ottomans. So yes, indeed, it's a very significant factor in today's world, and could become even more so should some of the great multi-ethnic states of Asia collapse as well.
The Soviet Union was a self-denying empire, so they're not claiming that they are an empire. And what was also characteristic about the Soviet Union, they provided the development, economic, cultural, and any sort of development in the periphery.
Sure.
And now we have Russia, aggressive with its aggressive foreign policies. To what extent the imperial drive is behind the Russian foreign policies now?
Sure. Well, I think that's 2 rather different questions, and let me sort of answer them in succession. The first is the Soviet Union as empire. I mean, arguing whether the Soviet Union was or was not an empire is, in my opinion, a fool's game. It all depends on your definition, and your definition usually depends on your ideological position, but also to some extent what you are trying to discover about the Soviet Union, from what angle you're approaching it. When I wrote my book all those years ago, in which I did define the Soviet Union as an empire, I did so firstly in the absolute awareness that if it was an empire, it was certainly a very unusual one, precisely because of its genuine commitment to raising the educational, cultural, and material level of its peripheral peoples to the same level as the Russians. I think the interesting question is to ask, to what extent does thinking about the Soviet Union as an empire help you to understand aspects of contemporary politics and even to some extent predict what might come next? And actually, I think one way, perhaps the most important way, in thinking of why thinking about the Soviet Union as an empire is very useful, is when you come to the consequences of its collapse. Because, when vast, multi-ethnic, very powerful countries disintegrate, that always causes tremendous instability in the international system. It also causes tremendous problems because you have communities in which many populations have lived intermingled, suddenly having to divide themselves into ethno-national states defined by nationality. And nationality suddenly brings on has a completely new importance. Because in a traditional dynastic empire, nationality is relatively unimportant. The emperor is sovereign. In a Marxist-Leninist communist party setup, really de facto the party elite is sovereign under democratic centralism. So it doesn't really matter whether you're an Armenian or a Georgian or this, or it doesn't matter that much. Once you begin setting up, independent nation states defined by nationality and drawing hard borders, then things become very difficult indeed, and nationality matters enormously. And if all these issues are very difficult with the collapse of any great empire, they're harder when you're talking about great land empires, precisely because metropolis and periphery, centre and colony, whatever you want to call it, the borders are not so clearly defined. And of course, because the former metropole, which tends still to be the most powerful state in the region, is directly involved in the border disputes, and its neighbours have to cope with a metropole which almost by definition has a sense of resentment, loss, decline, humiliation, all these things. So, in many ways, what's happened now in the former Soviet space, what is happening right now in Ukraine, although utterly terrible and indefensible, it's less surprising that it's happening now, if you're looking about historical comparisons and context, than that it didn't happen in 1988 to 92. It was utterly astonishing that a huge, if you want, empire with a very cruel political tradition disintegrated with almost no shot fired in its defense. Virtually no Russian died between 1988 and January 1992 violently as a result of the collapse of the empire. A handful of people did in Latvia. Almost no one died in Ukraine or Belarus. Almost no one died in Kazakhstan. In comparison to the collapse of most historical empires, that is absolutely staggering. You go back to the fact the collapse of the Austrian and Ottoman empires brings on world wars.
Professor, when we talk about empires, we have this understanding that it's a geographical notion connected to land and waters.
Yeah.
But in the current world, the human activity is very much connected also to the clouds. So to how this sort of evolution of the human activity is defined as an empire, or is it defined at all?
Well, look, of course, there are great differences now and in older history, but they're not 100%. Empires served the purpose of, very often, not always, protecting large-scale movements of goods, trade, large-scale movements of ideas. So the collapse of empires in the past also often had dire both economic and cultural consequences. Obviously now in our sort of globalized world with all these, communications linking regions together, it's more extreme. The obvious point is that one needs to preserve all the networks, all the global communications, all the cooperation, which is utterly essential if we're going to address global challenges, while at the same time accepting the disintegration of the old great imperial systems.
Professor Lieven, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Keep watching CivilNet.